Welcome to the final entry of this video series, in which I will summarize and reflect on everything that's been discussed here, from literature to movies, video games, and of course, Silent Hill 2. Now, first off, I would like to stress once more that the contents of this series were not meant to be exhaustive, but I do hope to have covered some representative milestones and given you a rough idea of and insights into significant developments within the world of Japanese horror from ancient until modern times, which I shall now review once more. Let us rewind to ancient Japan. Even in the earliest surviving works of Japanese literature from ancient Japan, it was possible to find texts that contained strange, uncanny, grotesque, or otherwise scary elements, which, in my opinion, comes as no surprise given that we humans have always been accompanied by sources of fear since the beginning of our existence. Amongst them, not only more tangible dangers such as wild animals, but also the unknown, be it in the form of eerie noises at night or in the form of phenomena that we do not understand. And so there have always been plenty of reasons for tales with scary content to exist ever since people were able to form coherent sentences. The earliest example I gave was a particular scene from the Kojiki from 712, the oldest surviving piece of Japanese literature. Therein, Izanagi went into the underworld and eventually saw the rotten body of his sleeping wife, Izanami, which was infested with maggots and had 8 gods of thunder living inside of it, staring back at Izanagi in the darkness. A horrific scene that was representative of the fact that in Shintoism, one of the oldest Japanese religions, death was associated with uncleanliness and the underworld was a gloomy place and the final destination for everyone. Another example, taken from the Konjaku Monogatari, which was written around the end of the Heian period, dealt with a wife being dragged away by an eerie arm of an unknown creature in a deserted mansion, only to be found dead sometime later. This story came from the genre of setsuwa, which is difficult to define, but would often consist of shorter stories that claimed to be accounts of real events. And while setsuwa is by no means a horror-only genre, you could certainly find setsuwa with grotesque, strange, or even outright terrifying content. Some setsuwa also contained didactic elements based on Buddhist doctrines and thus served to teach the reader a lesson, so horror was sometimes used for its shock value in these tales. I also briefly discussed fudoki, which were reports from provinces describing the respective province's distinct features, and some of these fudoki contained accounts of strange creatures or places, one of them even claiming that there was a cave in the province that had an entrance to the world of the dead. Examples like these demonstrate how ghosts, myth, and the supernatural were part of everyday life in ancient Japan and could often feel very tangible and close by. Medieval Japan then saw the rise of the warrior caste, the appearance of new Buddhist schools, internal conflicts, and eventually, country-wide war. Due to this, many prominent works of literature of medieval Japan focused on military affairs, heroic warriors, and Buddhist ideas. The warrior-centric genre of Gunki Monogatari, roughly translatable as tales of war, emerged and flourished during these turbulent times. But horror and the uncanny could still be found, and one example I gave of this was the story of the Nue, found in one of the most famous Gunki Monogatari, the Heika Monogatari, written between the 13th and 14th century. This story told of a strange black cloud approaching the emperor's palace every night and of the terrifying creature called Nue that lurked within it. In general, the belief in ghosts, oni, and other supernatural entities was as present as ever in medieval Japan, and topics like vengeful spirits of fallen warriors as well as uncanny encounters or strange occurrences do show up in various forms of medieval Japanese literature. But horror-themed tales and the actual intent to scare the audience were certainly not as prevalent as they would soon be in the time period that followed, namely early modern Japan and especially the Edo period. It was at the beginning of said Edo period that printing gained traction, with publishing houses spreading over the course of the following decades. This general spread of printing opened up all kinds of possibilities and meant a growth of the literate population. It was also during the Edo period that the term kaidan, nowadays usually translated as ghost story, appeared for the first time, possibly the first use of it being a collection of strange stories compiled in 1627 by Hayashi Razan, which was simply titled Kaidan. This collection was originally only created for the shogun, but was later printed as a kanazoshi called Kaidan Zensho, kanazoshi being books written with simpler characters which were therefore accessible to a wider audience. Eventually, Kaidan grew and grew in popularity until a whole Kaidan craze had developed in the Edo period, also fueled by a custom called Hyakumonogatari Kaidan-kai, where people would meet to tell 100 Kaidan in the dark. This custom was one of the reasons why Kaidan anthologies were in high demand almost from the start of the Edo period. The Edo period also saw an increased focus on women in connection with the supernatural, which eventually led to a popularization of female vengeful spirits. And while there must have been various complex reasons that caused this development, at least one can be found in the past when Buddhism and Confucianism had introduced ideas of female inferiority to Japan. Accordingly, Buddhist tales written long before the Edo period already contained stories of evil female ghosts, especially ghosts born from jealousy. But in the Edo period, with new printing technologies at hand, such tales were able to spread much faster and wider, and among these printing materials were also zokunsho, which dictated how women should behave and scolded female jealousy, as well as kangehon, which contained Buddhist tales, amongst which you could find many stories of jealous first wives turning into vengeful spirits after their death to attack the new wife of their husband, but not the husband himself. This, in particular, is reminiscent of a custom I had introduced quite early in the video series, namely the custom of uanari-uchi, where a former wife and her entourage would attack a new wife and the new wife's household, while men were usually not involved. This custom could be observed since around the end of ancient Japan's Heian period, whereas in early modern Japan's Edo period, the custom itself had mostly disappeared, but over time its basic concept of old wife attacks new wife seemed to have entered the world of literature, where the pattern would be reused again and again in stories about female vengeful spirits born from jealousy, and also found its way not only into Buddhist writings, but also into kaidan that were created for pure entertainment. It didn't seem to stop there though, as eventually you could find more and more kaidan that broke free from the classical uanari-uchi pattern and instead featured female onryo whose revenge was not limited to the new wife of their former husband anymore. Finally, in 1825, a theater play was performed which fit perfectly into this development and was so successful that it propelled the already ongoing popularization of female onryo to new heights. The kabuki play Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan, written by Tsuruya Namboku IV, which told of a woman called Oiwa who was wronged by several people, such as her despicable husband Iemon, and who returned as a female onryo that tricked Iemon into murdering his new wife and kept on haunting Iemon until he went mad and was slain by another man. Due to the immense success of this play, the terrifying ghost of Oiwa, further amplified by the various ingenious and elaborate stage tricks used during the play, became possibly the most famous female onryo back then that would influence not just early modern Japan, but Japanese horror in general for many years to come. This Oiwa can even be seen as a predecessor of Sadako, the female ghost from The Ring that has become so famous in contemporary J-horror. A few decades later, in the years 1853-1854, a certain US Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan, which had isolated itself in the 1630s, to open its borders, followed by the Meiji Restoration in 1868, which refers to the time when the shogunate was abolished and power returned to the emperor, and which is commonly used to define the beginning of Japan's modern period. The end of Japan's isolation was followed by a partial negation of Edo culture and an increased interest in Western culture. With regards to horror, this caused the works of influential non-Japanese authors such as Edgar Allan Poe or Mary Shelley to find their way to Japan, where they became new sources of inspiration. Also, in the 1880s, the concept of talking boards, nowadays commonly known as Ouija boards, found its way to Japan in the form of the game Kokkuri-san, which was a huge success and contributed to the emergence of Japanese parapsychology. Not much later, in 1890, Lafcadio Hearn came to Japan and would eventually become a Japanese citizen and take on the name Koizumi Yakumo. He took a deep interest in Japanese ghosts and ghost stories and compiled noteworthy anthologies, such as Kaidan Stories and Studies of Strange Things from 1904. His anthologies are regarded as some of the most popular and most important works of kaidan literature, which, despite the growing interest in Western culture, was far from dying out. Another prominent figure of this time was Yanagita Kunio, who tried to establish a proper study of Japanese customs and folklore and mostly concerned himself with folk legends, yokai, yurei, and the like. Now, it was also around the end of the 19th/beginning of the 20th century that the art of filmmaking gained traction all over the world, including Japan, which is why I then shifted the focus focus to this new art form. And here we learned that the first Japanese film studios were founded towards the end of the Meiji period, and most horror movies from around this time were film adaptations of popular kaidan, especially kaidan from the Edo period, such as Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan, Botandoro, or Bancho Sarayashiki, which are the ghost story of Yotsuya and Tokaido, the Peony Lantern story, and the story of the Manor of the Plates at Bancho. The 1920s and 1930s continued the kaidan movie trend and saw even more film adaptations of classical kaidan tales, led by ever new versions of these three particular famous works. At the start of the 1940s, however, many studios were merged during World War II and put under state control, but when the war ended, the number of studios rose again, and roughly 10 years after World War II, the six biggest Japanese film studios were Daiei, Nikkatsu, Shin-Toho, Shochiku, Toho, and Toei. Of these six, the two most representative studios with regards to horror elements were Daiei and Shin-Toho. Daiei produced some mystery movies and crime dramas, which often had a certain creepiness to them, as well as some science fiction films. But one of their most important works was the critically acclaimed Ugetsu Monogatari from 1953, which was loosely based on a famous Edo period book of the same name and contains quite a few atmospheric, uncanny, and scary scenes. Studio Shin-Toho, on the other hand, had been struggling financially after World War II, but in 1955, Okura Mitsugu had taken over as company president and managed to rein in some successes for several years, focusing heavily on the horror genre and making Shin-Toho the studio with the largest amount of ghost movies released during the mid to late 50s. And their most noteworthy horror film was yet another adaptation of Yotsuya Kaidan, the famous 1959 version directed by Nakagawa Nobuo. It was called Tokaido Yotsuya Kaidan, just like the original play, and did a great job at depicting a terrifying Oiwa whose vengeful spirit relentlessly pursued Iemon. Unfortunately, Studio Shin-Toho declared bankruptcy in 1961, but until then it had been a significant source of Japanese horror films during the mid to late 1950s. It was also during the 1950s that a different studio, Studio Toho, produced and released something that was quite unlike the numerous kaidan movies and instead portrayed a new kind of horror, namely that of apocalyptic destruction in the form of Godzilla, or Gojira as he was called in Japan. This movie was released in 1954 and directed by Honda Ishiro, whose experiences during World War II were reflected in the first movie's dark and destructive tone. Gojira kickstarted a whole genre of similar monster films called Kaiju Eiga, a genre that Studio Toho became particularly famous for and that they would continue to work on to this very day, at least at the time of me recording this. But Studio Toho also produced one of the most famous kaidan movies, despite normally barely touching the genre. This movie was called Kaidan, written with a W, and was released in 1964. It consisted of 4 fairly uncanny stories based on the previously mentioned anthologies by Lafcadio Hearns / Koizumi Yakumo. Still, despite the critical acclaim of the movie Kaidan, the overall enthusiasm for kaidan adaptations seemed to wear off, and one of the causes for this is thought to have been the growing influence of Western horror films. There still was one particularly noteworthy kaidan film, though, that I introduced to you, which was released by Studio Daiei in 1968 and was called Kaidan no Toshiana. This movie took traditional Japanese motifs and placed them into a contemporary setting, as its plot was pretty much a modernized reimagination of the Yotsuya Kaidan story. In my opinion, this movie is a great example of how traditional patterns from Japanese horror fiction, such as that of female vengeful spirits, became detached from their classical background and were combined with more modern settings. Japanese horror cinema of the 1970s and 1980s, however, began to turn away from such motifs for a while, and instead a lot of inspiration continued to be taken from Western works, with the 1973 US movie The Exorcist sparking new interest in psychic phenomena and occultism in Japan, whereas gore-heavy Western slasher and splatter films such as Halloween, Dawn of the Dead, Friday the 13th, or A Nightmare on Elm Street fueled the rise of Japanese slasher and splatter movies. In this regard, the emergence of direct-to-video releases in the Japanese 1980s called OVs gave creators of such gore-heavy works a perfect platform, since these OVs needed much less censorship than television or cinema. Therefore, you could find particularly gruesome and disturbing horror content among them, one example being the gore movie series Guinea Pig, which began in 1985 and was even mistaken for a snuff film by actor Charlie Sheen. Some of these OVs also mixed adult content with horror, such as Studio Nikkatsu's erotic horror OV movies. It was also during the 1980s that several Japanese video games were released that could be regarded as the first Japanese horror games, depending on your definition of a horror game, of course. The earliest example example I gave was a certain AX2 Uchuyu Sousen no Sutoromo from 1981 or 1982 as some sources claim, which might count as another example of Western cinema influencing Japanese horror during this time, since it was most likely inspired by the movie Alien, because the game dealt with an alien aboard a spaceship hunting you, and the spaceship in this game was called Nostromo, just like the spaceship in the movie Alien. Apart from this game, I also introduced some graphic text adventures released by the Nihon Falcom Corporation, such as Hora Hausu and Kyoki no Yakata, both from 1983 and possibly inspired by the earlier American graphical text adventure Mystery House from 1980, as well as Demon Zuringu and Ijigen Kara no Dashutsu, both from 1984. Finally, at the end of the 1980s, film director Kurosawa Kiyoshi had his first major debut when he wrote and directed Sweet Homu, distributed by Studio Toho in 1989. This film mixed gore elements with some classical Japanese elements, such as the appearance of a vengeful spirit, and was also of particular importance for the world of Japanese horror games, because a horror game based on the movie, also called Sweet Home, was created for the Famicom, and this game introduced ideas that would later be reused to create the first installment of the famous Resident Evil series, called Biohazard in Japan. Then in the 1990s, the world of Japanese cinema was led back towards less explicit and more atmospheric horror, as well as classical Japanese motifs, with Studio Toei's direct-to-video series Honto ni Atta Kowai Hanashi from 1991 and 1992, basically laying the groundwork for the later genre of J-horror. This series was created by director Tsuruta Norio, who, according to one source I found, actually said the following about the gore-heavy movies from the decades before. I quote, "These films were far too influenced by American cinema splatter and all went in the direction of Friday the 13th. I was very disappointed because these productions had little to do with the typical Japanese ghost stories." Quote end. And so, Honto ni Atta Kowai Hanashi did away with gore and shocking visuals and focused heavily on atmosphere, psychological tension, paranormal events, and typical Japanese elements instead. The concept of this series was actually based on an earlier manga magazine of the same name, with both the manga and the direct-to-video series presenting short stories that claimed to be based on true experiences. In this regard, both are said to have contributed to an increased popularity of allegedly true kaidan and urban legends in the years that followed, a development that had probably been helped along by the Japanese translation of Jan Harold Brunmann's book on urban legends, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, which came out in Japan in 1988 and caused a boom of urban legend compilations after its release. A particular genre that should also be mentioned in this regard was that of school kaidan, or gakko no kaidan, which refers to kaidan that are related to any kind of school setting and are often passed on as rumors by word of mouth. Such school ghost stories had existed for a long time already, but a proper boom occurred around 1990, and the concept eventually even led to a Japanese horror teledrama series called Gakko no Kaidan that aired in 1994 and was followed by various TV specials with a lot of prominent names from the world of Japanese horror cinema having worked on them. And although I can't say for sure if the famous book Ringu from 1991, written by Suzuki Koji, was influenced by any of these developments, I would argue that the 1998 film adaptation by Nakata Hideo is a great example of a Japanese horror movie that was influenced both by the atmospheric style of the Honto ni Atta Kowai Hanashi short films and the increased popularity of urban legends and allegedly true kaidan. This 1998 adaptation of Ringu, as well as the film Zoyure that came 2 years earlier, are usually considered to be the two works which truly kicked off the genre of J-horror, and this genre further perpetuated the popularization of female vengeful spirits and even brought them to international attention. With regards to the motifs of female ghosts and female vengeful spirits in particular, there were some new developments as well though, which I summarized as follows. 1. There was an increased focus on children, with a supernatural entity sometimes being a female child and/or their backstory focusing on their childhood, often portraying a girl with supernatural powers. This was sometimes accompanied by depictions of conflict between the child and their parent or parents. Sadako from Ringu or Alessa from the video game Silent Hill are pretty good examples of this. 2. There was a considerable increase in the depiction of vengeful spirits whose curse did not just befall those responsible for their unfortunate fate, but who indiscriminately targeted everyone, including total strangers. This was not a new concept per se, but the frequency with which it became used was definitely noteworthy. One famous example of this is Kayako from the Ju-on series created by Shimizu Takashi. J-horror also became popular outside Japan, especially when the 2002 American remake of Ringu called The Ring and directed by Gore Verbinski kicked off a whole wave of enthusiasm for J-horror in the Western world and inspired various westernized remakes of Japanese horror films, some of which were even directed by Japanese directors. Further noteworthy milestones from Japanese horror cinema that I brought up in this series were the horror films that Sweet Home's director Kurosawa Kiyoshi created between 1997 and 2006, which often used very particular and fascinating aesthetics and a deeply unsettling atmosphere, especially Cure and Kairo. Meanwhile, in the world of Japanese horror games from the 1990s and 2000s, the most noteworthy titles would often lean heavily into the recent return to more classical Japanese motifs or go for a distinctively non-Japanese presentation similar to what could be seen in Japanese horror cinema in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. With regards to the latter category, there was for instance the game Clock Tower from 1995, which dealt with a deformed serial killer child in a Norwegian mansion and was heavily inspired by Italian director Dario Argento and his movies from the 1970s and 80s. 1 year later, in 1996, a set of horror games came out that fit right into the other category. The games in question were the first two Twilight Syndrome games, called Twilight Syndrome Tansakuhen and Twilight Syndrome Kyumeihen. These games centered around school kaidan, urban legends, uncanny rumors spread by word of mouth, creepy atmospheric locations such as Japanese school grounds or a train station at night, and even referenced actual events and people related to the occult from Japanese media and pop culture from the 1990s, 80s, and 70s. Remember that a new occult boom in Japan had already began in the 1970s. Then there was the first Resident Evil or Biohazard in Japan, which was released in 1996 but had actually begun in 1993 as a project that would reuse elements from Fujiwara Tokuro's earlier game Sweet Home, but Resident Evil ended up with a setting that might have been inspired both by Japanese biohorror literature, which had become popular during the 1990s, and by US zombie films like George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead. Many of its sequels had similar settings and all of them mostly used explicit horror to create fear. It's also noteworthy that unlike Clock Tower and Twilight Syndrome, Resident Evil was actually also released outside Japan and would eventually turn into a huge and internationally successful franchise. Another milestone of Japanese horror games was the first Silent Hill game from 1999, which also used a presentation similar to that of Resident Evil but contained a lot more hints at its Japanese roots, such as using certain settings that were typical of Japanese ghost stories, playing on the superstitious fear of the number 4, or presenting a female supernatural entity that fit right into the most recent developments from J-horror cinema. Furthermore, while a lot of Resident Evil's horror was probably inspired by Western zombie films, Silent Hill's uncanny and deeply unsettling atmosphere and its often non-explicit horror was more in line with the recent developments from Japanese horror cinema. However, you could also find some Western influences such as the American horror film Jacob's Ladder. Similar to Resident Evil, Silent Hill released internationally and became a successful franchise as well. Then, 2 years after Silent Hill 1, the first Zero game came out in Japan, and even though this game wasn't as successful as Resident Evil or Silent Hill, it was the first major Japanese horror game that got released internationally while fully embracing a Japanese setting and making heavy use of elements from both traditional and modern Japanese horror. It drew inspiration from kaidan, urban legends, and J-horror movies, combining elements like female vengeful spirits with long black hair, folkloric research, gruesome religious rituals, and more. Finally, another noteworthy title that went for a distinctively Japanese presentation was Siren, first released in 2003. However, whereas the first Zero and its sequels are more of a classic Japanese horror experience, Siren and its sequels mixed all of their Japanese elements as well as some non-Japanese elements with a surreal and bizarre atmosphere and with stories that were as insane as they were confusing, but in a good way. Now, as mentioned a few times before, I sadly didn't get into discussing any more recent horror works because my thesis was written in 2009, 2010, and it was already a lot of work putting all the contents from that into video form. But there was one more important chapter in which I focused solely on Konami's horror game Silent Hill 2. And if I now try to look at it against the backdrop of everything that's been discussed, then I would say it could be best described as a complex hybrid of both classical and modern elements from Japan, mixed with some non-Japanese ingredients. The story of James and Mary almost follows the pattern of a woman who meets with a terrible fate at the hands of a man only to come back as a ghost and seek revenge, which can be found in famous Japanese classical stories like Yotsuya Kaidan, Bancho Sayayasuki or Kasane Plays, but also in more modern works such as the movie Kaidan no Toshiana or Ju-on, except that here the pattern has somewhat changed and is interwoven with concepts from Western psychology, in particular with ideas found in psychoanalysis such as repression or the unconscious mind. In other words, while in classical stories the woman comes back to haunt the man as an actual vengeful spirit, here she comes back as a psychological ghost born from the man's own psyche in the form of a ladder that leads James to a terrifying journey into his own unconscious mind where he has to face punishment for what he has done. These psychological elements are then also further explored through the addition of other characters with repressed memories or urges. And just like the first Silent Hill game, all of this was placed in a US-American setting, possibly inspired by the success of the Japanese horror game franchise Resident Evil, which had done the same thing prior to Silent Hill. As for classical elements, it's also interesting to note that the disfigured Mary is actually quite reminiscent of typical depictions of Yotsuya Kaidan's Oiwa after her disfigurement. Now, in terms of atmosphere, Silent Hill 2 followed in the footsteps of its predecessor Silent Hill 1 because its uncanny atmosphere and mostly non-explicit and psychological horror can be seen as a continuation both of the earlier title Silent Hill 1 and of the even earlier precedent set by Honto ni Atta Koayanashi and later J-horror movies. You can also find influences like the works of Western filmmaker David Lynch in Silent Hill 2 though. And sadly, while I feel like I could probably keep rambling on about horror and Silent Hill and whatnot, this series finally has to come to an end here. It may have been far from exhaustive, and there are probably still many interesting connections and developments to discover that I never touched upon, but I do hope nonetheless that it could give you some interesting insights into the exciting world of Japanese horror from ancient until fairly recent times. I also hope that I could perhaps introduce some works to you that you had never heard of before and could perhaps even inspire you to check them out for yourself. As for me, I can't deny that working on all this wasn't always easy, but it's a topic I love, and so I definitely also had a lot of fun, both during my original research, back when I wrote my graduation thesis in 2009-2010, and again during the creation of this video series, when I researched many topics once more and even made some new discoveries, which I then included exclusively in this series. In general, examining works of horror is, well, obviously a lot of fun if you're a fan of the genre, but there's more to it than just that. Just like works from most genres, horror fiction too can be a reflection of the society and of cultural norms surrounding the time of its creation. Tales of the world of the dead in early modern Japan, for instance, were indicative of prevailing Shinto beliefs concerning the afterlife. And to give another example, the increased amount of Japanese horror fiction in the late 1990s and onwards that dealt with dubious religions, cults and the like might have been indicative of a grown distrust of cults and religions within Japanese society following the horrific terror attacks by the Aum sect in 1994 and 1995. Furthermore, due to the often gruesome and disturbing topics that horror fiction covers, it can also shine a spotlight on subjects that many other genres might shy away from, or even cause us to reflect on questions of ethics, humanity, and more. As such, I think that there is a lot more to gain from experiencing and examining horror fiction than just thrill and excitement, although that in and of itself is already a great reward if you ask me. But with that, I think we have reached the end of this video series. I would like to say that I hope to see you in the next video, and who knows, maybe I'll find some more topics to make videos about that are similar to these, but for now, this is the end. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, take care and goodbye.